that thing. I did all the explanation, didn't I, about how I was going to record and when I was going to stop recording. And then I forgot to record. So let's start that again. You'll notice here that the title is Scottish Myths, Legends, Folk Tales, and Nature Connection. I could have also put in the folklore. And so there are huge differences between a lot of these definitions. And it's not always really clear. So when we talk about myths and mythology, we're often talking about old stories that might relate to how the land has been formed, a lot of old stories about the way things are, about how nature is formed, about how the world came to be. Legends are often associated with place. They might be things that have been claimed to have happened and have been true, or aren't proven. They might be related to people and historical events, but they might still have a fantastical element to them. And folklore and folk tales are often the stories and the lore that people have shared over time, passed down from community to community. And all of these things can blur with each other. And this project here, the Moorfoot Tales, is a book and an ecotherapy program. So I live in this rural part of Scotland in the southeast, and it's not very far from the capital of Edinburgh. It's super rural. It's a place of hills and rivers and woodlands, and it's very sparsely populated. And as a storyteller and a lover of folklore, I noticed that there wasn't many myths and legends being spoken about from this area in the books that I was reading and at the storytelling events I was going to. So I won't talk too much about where I got the stories from and how I put the book together, but that's where this book came from. It was from me really digging into the area where I live, and the ecotherapy program I've put together, which I'll talk about later in this session, is a 2-month program where a group of us will come together, and I will encourage you to take these stories and to really bond with the nature in your own neighborhoods, and also find some nature related myths and legends in your own in your own location, in your own locality, but also to create from what you find, to create from your nature experiences. So I'll talk more about that later, but just to give you that background, it's been such a beautiful process, and it's just really opened my eyes in a new way to the nature of where I live. So coming back to Scotland as a whole, if you take a look here, it's you can see that the country is broken down into different council areas, and the first myths and legends I'm going to share with you are ones that you can find pretty much all over Scotland. And then we'll slowly move down to, there's a little purple dot in the southeast above the orange Scottish borders. And that's where I am in Midlothian. And I'm going to share a story with you that very few of you will have heard before. And we're going to use that story as a nature connection exercise. But we're going to begin on the biggest scale as we can with the folklore in Scotland. And we're going to begin with the CAILLEACH. So this is Scotland's origins, the CAILLEACH. She was the woman who created Scotland, and she came from a time before time began. She came from who knows where, we don't know. Some people claim that she came from Norway, that she was actually in Norway first, and she saw this place where there was this opportunity to really create her own land. Some people say she came from somewhere that's unfathomable, a place that can never be defined and can never be known. But she came, by all accounts, with a hammer, and she had blue skin, she had one eye. And when I say she was a giant, she was a giant. It's hard to even imagine how big this goddess was, but the land was formed by a goddess, not a god, but by a goddess. And she came and she smashed up the land. She carried rocks. She created seats for herself. When she dropped rocks, they formed islands. She created rivers from holes she made in the mountains that she created. And this image here is from an incredible book. It's quite an old book called Wonder Tales of Scottish Myth and Legend. It's about, came out in the early 20th century. And for me, it's almost like a Scottish folklore Bible. It's got a very beautifully written account of the Cailleach and how she came to be, and a lot of the stories that are associated with her. And so here you can see the land itself, some of the Cailleach's creations. On the left of the screen, you can see Ben Nevis, which is the largest mountain in Scotland. That was a photograph that I found online. But on the right here, you can see the Isle of Barra. This is a photo I took on my holidays in 2020. You might not be familiar with these sorts of images when you think about Scotland, but the beaches in Scotland on the west coast, and on the islands up in the northwest, and out here, especially in the Outer Hebrides, are just stunning. They're absolutely gobsmackingly beautiful. They're very cold a lot of the time, but you can't have everything. And these were all created by the Cailleach according to mythology. So she smashed up the ground, and Ben Nevis there, that mountain you see on the left, was her seat. That's where she would sit, and she would look over the whole of the land that she created. And the Isle of Barra, these mountains and hills you see in the background, these are rocks that she dropped off from her back when she was carrying them from one place to another, and these rocks became the islands. But not everything that she created had such a romantic story behind it. So where I live down in the southeast, there aren't that many Cailleach stories besides this one. So this is a hill in East Lothian, and it's rumoured to be the Cailleach's stool. So the Cailleach is not very what's the word? His mythology doesn't really come through, and it isn't really that common and popular in the folklore of the southeast. But this hill in which is called North Berwick Law, in the town of North Berwick in East Lothian. I've climbed it myself. I had no idea that I was climbing a poo at the time, I have to say. There's a lot of wild ponies there. It's by a beautiful beach, and you'll see these really nice tweed, colourful houses beneath it there. But this is one of the main bits of folklore from the south. So I don't know what the Cailleach thought of the lowlands of Scotland, but obviously not very much according to folklore, because she came down, took a poo and left. Having said that, it's also noted that all of the mountains and hills in Scotland were made by the Cailleach. So I'm going to take it that the other hills that I've seen around here, the many ranges in the lowlands, have also been made by her, and preferably not in the same fashion as North Berwick Law. Interestingly, when you get into the southeast of Scotland, the Cailleach starts to disappear, as I said, and these other goddess and hag figures start to become more well known. You start to hear stories about the Gaia Carling, and there is sometimes some debate over whether the Cailleach or the Gaia Carling made the poo at North Berwick Law. So according to this story here, and this is one I found in a book called East Lothian Folktales by Tim Porteous. It's a really great little book of folklore from East Lothian. And the Gaia Carling was a supernatural goddess hag who fed on the intestines of Christian men. So she didn't like Christians very much. She especially didn't like Christian men. She would hunt them down, and she would eat their intestines. And she found one particular man's intestines so hilarious that she farted, and that's how North Berwick came to be. some very nasty material came from her behind, and this is how North Berwick came to be. So we don't know whether the Gaia Carling or the CAILLEACH did this. Now I'm going to move away from the poo because I know a lot of you are here for a beautiful nature connection experience. But what I'm interested in with this is not so much how this mountain came to be, but more about the way in which there are a lot of these goddess figures who are recorded to have created the land in Scotland. So when we get into the southeast, we don't hear so much about the CAILLEACH, although a lot of people say she created all of Scotland. We might hear about the Gaia Carling, who I told you about. Now, some people say that they may be the aspects of the same goddess, but under different names and taking different forms. But there are also these other few really interesting figures in the southeast. So there's Nick Nevin, who's often called Queen of the Witches. And there is some suggestion that in legend, she was a woman who was possibly banned as a witch. Some people call her the Scottish Hecate, and some people say that she is also an aspect of the CAILLEACH, but she's a very different figure. She's not a giant, she's more of a creature of our size by all accounts. And there's also the fairy queen of Elfame. And this, I find this really interesting. So Elfame is you can see in brackets the Elfheim, which means elf home essentially in Scots, or elf land. And she's such a different figure to the CAILLEACH. She really is. One of the most famous stories, which I will talk about shortly, is linked to is linked to a hill, but she lives beneath the hills. So sometimes you will hear people perhaps alluding that the fairy queen of Elfame, or the queen of the fairies, is an aspect of the CAILLEACH, but I'm not really sure about that. I wonder if it is just that all these fabulous goddesses were dividing up the land, and kind of taking their own share. But where myth and folklore is concerned, there is no right or wrong. You know, these stories mean so many different things to us on an individual level. But I find it just very fascinating that when we go back to pre-Christian times, that the creators of the land and the people who really ruled the land were female figures. But around the edges of the land is a different kind of supernatural creature that's found all over Scotland. So these are the Selkies. And you may or may not have heard of the Selkies before, but the Selkies are the seal people of Scotland, and they are not only found in Scotland. You will find them in other Celtic nations and perhaps in other Scandinavian nations also. As far as I know, but stories have a way of traveling, especially nature-based folklore has a way of traveling. So who knows where else the Selkies can be found, but the Selkies are the seal people. So underneath the skin of each Selkie is a human being. So they're shapeshifters, and the Selkies come to land. There are many stories recorded over hundreds or even thousands of years where they've made relationships with humans. They don't often turn out particularly well, but the Selkies can take off their seal skins. They might leave them at the shore. They might wander around in human form on land and then go back and take their seal skin and return back to the land, to their homes under the sea, or perhaps in islands to be found in the sea. And about 40% of the world's grey seal population breed at colonies in Scotland. And so you can see why they are so important as animals to the Scottish folklore, in Scottish folklore. And you will find these stories everywhere. And this particular picture is of a seal pup at Inchkeith Island, which is not very far from where I live in the southeast. You see Inchkeith Island from Midlothian. You can see it from the capital of Edinburgh. And that brings me on here. You can see a picture of Inchkeith Island here. And there actually aren't very many islands on the east coast of Scotland. So the majority, the vast majority are on the west coast. There are around 790 islands in Scotland. And on the east coast, there's probably about 10. So that's not an exact number, I don't think, but it's not far off. It's around this number. And from the fields where I live, I can look out, I can see the sea, and I see this island, and it really enchants me, the sight of it. It's about 15, 20 miles away, but there's something about it that just allures me. When I'm walking on the field, my dog, I can see over the fields, over the city of Edinburgh, over to the hills of Fife there in the background. And so I did a little bit of research and thought, you know what, I bet you there is some folklore about this place. And of course, it's somewhere where the Kelpies are. Interestingly enough, I couldn't find Selkie stories from this particular island, even though it's I'm actually going for a little boat trip there in a few weeks, because there are so many grey seals there in the autumn that it's completely, the whole place is covered. It's just like one big huge seal colony. So I'll see a lot of Selkies, no doubt, but the stories relate to Kelpies on this particular island. And the Kelpies, you will get stories of them also all over Scotland. And this monument you can see here on the left stands at over 100 foot in Falkirk in central Scotland. It's just an absolutely amazing monument. It really is. You drive past it and it's just this huge piece of folklore, you know, as you drive past on the motorway. It's incredible. And I think a lot of people don't realize when they drive past, they you know, it's quite a famous monument in Scotland, but perhaps don't realize that this is coming directly from Scottish mythology, and it's a way of this monument is a way of honoring that in a really modern and quite beautiful and striking way. And so the Kelpies were really unusual creatures. I should say are. I'm saying were because the stories are old, but you know, obviously they are still in existence. So there's so I can see a question here. Are the Selkies the origins of mermaids and mermen? I would say probably not, because the mermaids and mermen can be found all over the world, in folklore all over the world. And there's also some mermaid folklore in Scotland as well. And sometimes it crosses over with Kelpies and also with Selkies. Oh, you asked if Selkies were, not the Kelpies, but yeah, but I don't think the Selkies came before. I think in Scotland they mingle with some folklore around mermaids, but yeah, whereas the Selkie legends are often concentrated around this part of Europe in general. Mermaid stories you can find all over the world. So who knows what came first? But the Kelpies will come out of water, so they are water horses. They're horses that live in the water. They will come out. They might be friendly, they might not. A lot of the stories, they're quite horrific. Actually, some of the stories, often they will entice somebody onto their back, and somebody might go and sit on the pretty horse's back, you know, and stroke away on this really inviting looking animal, and then it will go running off into the sea, taking the person with them. In some stories, that's, you know, understandably the end of the human, but in some other stories, they end up at the bottom of the sea in some magical place where you can breathe, and there's a whole other world down there. And there are a lot of stories about underworld cities and underworld lands. in Scottish folklore, and sometimes the Kelpies are linked to them, as well as the Selkies more often so. So the Kelpies you want to watch out for. These water horses are quite scary beings, really. If you ever see a very wet horse on the edge of a loch or the sea, and you're thinking that you might, for some inexplicable reason, want to climb on its back and go for a ride, don't do it, folks. You have been warned. And here, I hope you can see the top there. I think the Zoom the gadget there might be, widget there might be in the way. But this slide is about the fairies. And so fairies are huge in Scottish folklore, and they have all kinds of different names. And in fact, you could say, and some people do say, that the Kelpies and the Selkies are actually a type of fairy, and that fairy is potentially this catch-all name for any supernatural being in Scottish folklore. But although you can define fairies in that way, I think it's helpful to look at them in the way that they are often spoken about in Scottish folklore. So they're often, when people talk about fairies, they're referring to the little people. So in other countries, they might be known as elves or gnomes, but they're quite different. Elves and gnomes, they're kind of like the cousins of fairies. They have different characteristics. And when I talk about fairies, they're not like the fairies of Disney, where they, you might think of wings and a little wand and someone come to grant wishes. There are some fairies like that, but not very many. This is a very Disneyfied, very reinterpretation of the ancient fairies, who were like little people who lived in the hills, and you made offerings to them. And they could be friends of humans, they could be the enemies of humans. They are up there at the top. I don't know if you can see it, you might not, but it's one of the kinds of fairies were called brownies. And with the brownies, they would like to do work for humans. So they lived outside, and they would come in at night. You would leave them some milk, and you might leave something to eat for your brownie, and they'll come in and they'll clean up for you, just because they like to clean. So, they're a very good friend to have, the brownies. And you can build up this kind of relationship with a brownie, but you must never offer them clothing. So a lot of the old stories have got these strange events recorded where people decided, you know what, these poor fairies are doing so much work for us, I'm going to buy them a nice suit, a nice outfit to wear. And the brownies hate that. There's a lot of talk about why, but we don't necessarily know. I think some people claim that it's because they feel like they're becoming your property, or like you're giving them a uniform, and they don't like that. So they will often disappear. So just the milk, perhaps a little biscuit, is all perfectly fine. But there are other stories as well. The URISKS are a kind. There can be fairy animals, as we've talked about. You might hear about TROWIES right up in the north and on the islands in Shetland and Orkney, I think, is where the TROWIES are more well known, and they're more underground fairies. Most of them live underground, but the TROWIES, there's some great stories about them being linked with as being very musical. So it's always linked with the land. The HARES, the HARES, I think I've just invented a new bit of folklore of my own. I do not want to meet the HARES on a dark night, though. So the fairies, they mostly live in hills. Sometimes they might live in forests, but most of the time not. Often they'll be in open lands, living in the hills, living underground. And the image that you can see here is an image of the forest just near where I live. And I always get fairy vibes here. There's just something about it. And very often the stories of fairies, as with a lot of the folklore in Scotland and in all places really, they're so linked to the land that it's not the case that a lot of people will say that they think that these creatures live in a very physical way, and that, you know, we are, you know, you're going to go out and you're going to see them with your own eyes, but more a sense of you are in a place, and these creatures, these stories that we tell, they capture the mood of the place so perfectly. And they exist in some way that is just really hard to explain. They exist in some way that you cannot put your finger on. But I don't expect to go walk into this forest one day and see a fairy in a physical form. But when I go and sit in some places, and really this sort of place here, that I'm showing to you, is not a typical fairy place, really. It's really more hills, according to folklore, than forest. But sometimes you sit and you just get this, if you could put the energy of the place into an image, you would paint one of these little people. And there's something here around nature connection with these old myths and these old legends that sometimes we just need to put logic aside and say, you know what, this makes so much sense to me here. There is so much beauty in this place. And there is something almost tangible in this place that I can feel, that I can experience. And this image that humans have shared over time, these stories that we've told, they captured it so well. Perhaps you might say they live on another realm and we tune into that other realm. Or you might say it's part of your imagination, and you can interpret it however you like. But there is something in these stories that just describes the land that we walk on. And so I'm going to actually invite you to check out the story of Thomas the Rhymer. I won't go into it too much here today because I've gone a wee bit over already, but he was a very famous legendary figure, and he did really exist as a human being, Thomas the Rhymer, you know, going way back 900 years ago or somewhere around then. And this is a picture of his tower in the Scottish borders where I went recently. Another place with a tangible energy, this old ruin. This old ruin is really about 900 years old. And this image you see on the left is an image of the very famous story where he was taken away by the Queen of Elfame, the Queen of the Underworld. And that's her on the horse. She came to take him, according to folklore, and he came back with the gift of prophecy. So it's a really fascinating story. And it really mingles with the legend of this real human being as well. So I love the way myth and the land and nature mingles with history a lot of the time. But now I want to share this with you. So this is a place in the Moorfoot Hills where I live, and it's quite a gruesome story. This is a legend, but it's been recorded. It looks like it's probably historical, and this ruin here that you see is called HIRENDEAN Castle. And when you sit up in the Moorfoot Hills and you look out at this place here, this ruin is there's barely anything left of it. It's a very old, we don't know much about it, but more of a tower than a castle. And one day, the Earl of Lothian, back in, it says here 1620, but it was actually 1624, I'm pretty sure. So I need to correct that on the slide there. But the Earl of Lothian was one of the most privileged men in the land. And he came home one day, he went into the castle, and he took a dram of whiskey, picked up a knife, and he stabbed himself 3 times in the stomach, and then he cut his own throat. And he threw down his knife, and and not really much is asked about it. So I can see some questions coming up there, folks, saying, and I'll come back to these at the end. So perhaps if Lucas, if you could please make a wee note of them, and I'll answer them at the end, that would be great. So thanks for that, folks, and sorry if I haven't got to you so far. But this story, after I wrote the Moorfoot Tales, this story wasn't in there. And I kept coming across information online that said there was some myth relating to Hirendean Castle. And I kept hitting dead ends and I couldn't find it. And after the book was released, I was walking in the hills and I kept coming back to, I was just looking at this ruin, this enchanting ruin out in this gorgeous green open space. And something in me was just, I needed to find out what this myth was, what this legend was. And this is the story that I found. But there's more to it than this. So in the book that I wrote a lot about a woman called Margaret Unis. She was an innocent Moorfoot woman executed for witchcraft in 1628. In the book that I wrote, she wakes up after almost 400 years of death upon Black Hope Scar, which is the highest hill in the Moorfoot range. And she comes up time and she became really integral to the book for me. I went out looking for mythology and folklore, and I kept coming back to this woman's real life story, how she was innocently murdered for being a witch. And there was hardly any information about her online at all, apart from this little bit of info that's here on this website clipping you can see here. So like a lot of so-called witches who were, innocent women who were often tortured into confession, you could put your finger at anybody and accuse them of being a witch, and you could become the scapegoat of your village and end up getting killed. And that's exactly what happened to Margaret Unis. But after I'd written the book and I'd weaved her story in and out of a lot of the other myths and legends I wrote about, that was when I got called to this Hirendean castle and found out about Rob and KERR. And if you look at on the web, on this page here that I've clipped at the very bottom, you can see that accusations about Margaret Unis extended to include the death of the Earl of Lothian and Lord Borthwick. And something in my mind just went like, this can't be related. That would be too strange. It would be too weird for this to be the same Earl of Lothian that I've just found this story about upon Black Hope Scar in the hills. But it turns out it must have been, it had to have been. And so these two stories are so linked to each other. Part of the reason that this woman was killed was because of the bizarre suicide of this Earl of Lothian, and clearly the family wanted to blame somebody. They wanted to have some explanation as to why he would do such a thing. And as so often happened in the day, you found a woman, you usually found a poor woman, you called her a witch and you blamed her. Now, I don't think it's always that straightforward. I think a lot of people genuinely believed that this was happening. It wasn't as clear as just wanting to have a scapegoat, but essentially, if all people were already blaming you for, for misdeeds or for the devil's work, in a certain area, you were bound to be accused of all kinds, because that's what you became known for. The person who did all of the bad things. Somehow you created a spell. You killed someone who killed themselves by weaving some demonic spell upon them, which made them do this to themselves. And you might wonder why I'm talking about this so much in an ecotherapy session, but you may not see that at the top there, but there's the term I've used up there is archaeotherapy. And some of you might be familiar with that term who've come to 10 Directions workshops. It's a term that my colleague Harriet Sams has been coining and doing a lot of work with. But these places in nature, these ruins that hold so many stories and hold so much of the past out there in wide open space, that you almost feel the stories amongst them. And here is no different. I went up and I made a small offering for Margaret Unis and also for the Earl of Lothian. Whatever happens there was very dark. My offering was primarily for Margaret Unis. I thought, you know, so few people have thought about this woman in 400 years, and I just want to reflect upon that, about how humans and nature, we're not separate from each other. And I know I'm preaching to the converted with you folks here. You've come here for a reason. I don't need to say that, but all the same, I think there's a tendency, even for those of us who are you know, quite connected with nature, to see maybe a human-made structure as something that is separate from nature. I think it's part of our psyche a lot of the time, to think in that way. And actually, you know, here is a place that represents a human story, but also out in the wilds. And there is something really special about these places, these parts of nature where human history mingle with growth and new life. And so I just wanted to flag up how, you know, how powerful this has been for me, and to, you know, to encourage you yourself, if you are ever going past buildings or old ruinous places and you feel like you want to just stop for a few moments and spend some time there. And I think we often do, you know, do it for yourself, stop and spend that time. I think we all have these feelings around ruins and old places. And so what I would like to do is share something with you, a wee story, quite briefly. It's quite small. You could call it a story meditation, if you like, and it'll be about 5 minutes. And I would like you to just make yourself comfortable for a moment. We're going to move on to a different story from the Moorfoot area. And I'd like you to close your eyes if you feel comfortable doing that, or you can lower them. I'd like you just for a moment, just to notice your breath at the tip of your nose. Just notice if you're breathing a short breath or a long breath. Anything is fine. Whatever your breath is doing is perfectly fine, but just notice. And I'd like you to bring to mind a tree. I'd like you to imagine that you're sitting down somewhere and it's spring. You can feel the warmth in the air, but there's also still a coolness in the breeze. The sun is out and it's bright. You can hear more birds singing than you've heard for a while, for a long time. And wherever you are in front of this huge oak tree, you're just feeling completely relaxed, safe, at peace. And you're looking up at this enormous oak tree that reaches up higher into the sky than any oak tree you've ever seen. It's close enough for you to reach out and just stroke the bark of the trunk with the tips of your fingers. You just feel how dry and how strong the bark is. And you can just see the fresh leaves and the growth, this mighty tree. You've never seen such an incredible tree, just completely in awe. You've got that smell of the grass around you. You've got this feeling of safety, almost of being looked after and being really connected with this oak tree. And you notice somebody come up and stand underneath the tree. It's an old man, and he doesn't see you, but you can see him. He's somebody from quite a long time ago, many hundreds of years ago. You notice all of a sudden in the background, there is a huge old castle that you didn't notice before. And you see a small twig break, one of the branches breaks off this tree and falls down into this man's hands. And he looks at the twig like it has so much meaning, like he's just been given a message from this tree. And he nods his head like he understands something. And he walks off towards the castle, looking sad but grateful for the message that he's had from this tree. And so this tree that you've seen is called the EDGEWELL tree. And this tree was famous in the Dalhousie area of Midlothian in Scotland for many hundreds of years, up until perhaps 300 years ago or more. And it was famous because this tree loved the people at Dalhousie Castle, and it was so connected with the people who cared for the tree that when a human who lived within this castle or worked for it died, a small piece of the tree would snap in sympathy with the humans who it was so connected with. So one of its human friends would die and a piece of the tree would die with it. And you see, what you saw when you saw this man take this twig away was not sadness, but a moment of beauty in this connection that he felt with the tree. This connection that he had with this completely different kind of this completely different species, this amazing life that the tree has that we just really don't understand or are only just beginning to. And so I'd like you just to take a moment to reflect on the connections that we have with trees. I'd like you just to take a moment to think of all the ways that you're connected with trees, and you might even call a particular tree to mind. Or if not, you might like to just give a moment to think about all of the ways in which we're connected. You might like to bring your attention back to the breath, back to the tip of your nose. Just offer some gratitude to the images you brought to your mind, whether it was a particular tree, or trees more broadly. Whenever you're ready, you can open your eyes. You don't need to bring them back to the screen yet if you don't want to. You might like to share something in the chat if you like, but there's no pressure, no expectation. That can be about any thoughts or feelings at all around nature connection. And so I'm going to stop the screen share for a moment. And see all your lovely faces again for a moment. And I will stop the recording there.